Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another Instant Deck Tech. So last week, we spent all week looking at decks for Kaladesh Standard. This week, we're sticking with Kaladesh, but we're expanding our search out. We're going to have a deck for every constructed format this week. One for Standard, one for Modern, one for Legacy, and even one for Vintage, featuring new Kaladesh cards. So first up, we have Standard, and we're going to be looking at Green-Red Gearhulks today. This deck is really sweet. It recently took George Carr to a top 8 finish at a SCG Standard IQ, so congrats to George on their finish with the deck. A quick reminder before we break it all down, if you enjoy this deck and you want to see it in action, take a minute, click the like button, the subscribe button, leave a comment, anything you can do to support your deck, because whichever deck is most popular gets a shot at being made into videos next week. So Green-Red Gearhulks is essentially Gearhulk Tribal. We are looking to play efficient threats right up the curve in green and red from 2 to 6 mana. Topping off this curve is the Gearhulk. So we have 4 combustible Gearhulks, just massive first striking, maybe dealing a bunch of damage to the face, or in the worst case, drawing a bunch of cards, which still isn't bad. And Verdurous Gearhulk, which gets to either be massive as an 8/8 trample, or spread around some counters to other creatures and help them get through some like pseudo haste damage. There's also some +1/+1 counter synergies we'll talk about as we go along, but these are kind of the big top end payoff cards. Moving down the curve a little bit, we have some ramps. So if we're playing these 5-drops, 6-drops, we want to get to them quickly. Hedron Crawler, play it on turn 2, gets us to 4 mana on turn 3, Verdurous Gearhulk on turn 4, etc. Hedron Archive does a bit of ramping, lets us play multiple spells in the same turn, gets us up to Combustible Gearhulk, plus we can always cash it in to draw some cards, which is a nice option to have in a green-red deck that doesn't have that much card advantage. The rest of the creatures, you can kind of see the curve here. Sylvan Advocate, the second 2-drop along with Hedron Crawler, just very efficient. Getting counters from Verdurous Gearhulk lets it win the Sylvan Advocate war, so kind of like Tarmogoyfs in Modern. If your Sylvan Advocate is a 3/4, it's attacking through your opponent's Sylvan Advocates. Tireless Tracker gets huge, gets +1/+1 counters, draws you a bunch of cards thanks to the clue tokens. Bristling Hydra is a weird one. I haven't really seen this outside of energy decks, but basically it's a 5/4 for 4 mana, which is pretty big, and plus if you don't spend that energy right away, you can use it to protect Bristling Hydra from a removal spell because it gains hexproof when you put the +1/+1 counter on it. And then just 1 World Breaker, pretty expensive, but the deck does have a decent amount of ramp, but it's a nice repeatable answer to things like Smuggler's Copter, Sky Sovereign, some of the big powerful artifacts. World Breaker is in a good place. The problem is it's expensive, so you might be dead to Smuggler's Copter before you get to World Breaker, but it is a really strong answer to that, so it's worth keeping in mind moving forward. Then we get some crazy stuff. Animation module essentially it gives you tokens whenever a +1/+1 counter goes on something. So when you sack a clue with Tireless Tracker on the battlefield, it gets a +1/+1 counter. You can pay 1, get a 1/1 servo token. When Verdurous Gearhulk spreads around the counters, you can pay 1, get a token. And then you can sort of proliferate. For 3 mana, you can choose a counter on a creature or a player, or a permanent or a player, and then you give another counter of that type. So if your Tireless Tracker has a +1/+1 counter for 3 mana, you can give it another +1/+1 counter. Really odd choice, but there are a lot of synergies in the deck. Verdurous Gearhulk, Tireless Tracker, Bristling Hydra, all have +1/+1 counter synergies, and most of them are fairly cheap, so you can kind of make tokens with it, make your big things even bigger. And then we have a tiny bit of removal and some protection / removal. Blossoming Defense does double duty, fizzles a removal spell, can also hit one of your creatures during combat where your opponent thinks they've lined up a good block and then kill their creature. Welding Sparks is an odd choice for removal, but it does 3 damage at instant speed, so it takes down a Smuggler's Copter, which is reasonable. Plus, it can do even more because you have Hedron Crawlers, Hedron Archives, a few artifacts sitting around, so in the late game, it might be able to take down something even bigger. As far as the mana base, really straightforward. The dual lands, the basic lands, what you would expect. In the sideboard, the deck has a ton of answers to Smuggler's Copter, 3 plummets, 3 appetite for the unnatural, 1 clip wings. So plummet hits Avacyn plus Smuggler's Copter, appetite for the unnatural hits Smuggler's Copter plus other vehicles and artifacts, even enchantments. Clip wings takes care of Smuggler Copter plus Emrakul. Fall the Titans and Nissa's Renewal give the deck some other options on the top end of the curve. Fall the Titans can kind of kill 2 creatures. Nissa's Renewal, good in aggro matchups. If you ramp into it quickly enough, it's a good stabilization card. And then for Commencement of Festivities, basically a 2-mana fog that only prevents damage to players. So if you're worried about aggro decks and getting beaten down before you get your Gearhulks online, this is just 2 mana, fizzle and attack, helps you buy the time you need to get your big powerful things on the battlefield. Anyway, that is Green-Red Gearhulks for Standard, and that's been our Instant Deck Tech for today. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will talk to you soon.